Thank you so much. Also, that was an amazing talk, especially kind of going into this conversation as well. So my name is Jordan. I'm a PhD student in HCI at Carnegie Mellon, and my work looks at the relationship between queer culture and art and how that's manifested in the current context related to generative AI. So as is kind of really well established by a lot of research from people like y'all in the fact community, like it's really well known that generative image models and generative AI models tend to stereotypically represent queer people. At the same time, queer people are often excluded from data sets that are used to train generative AI models. For example, language used within the queer community, such as the word twink, famously showed up on a block list that was used to quote-unquote clean the colossal clean corpus data set. But there's a lot of work talking about the ways that queer people are represented by AI, but queer people are rarely figured as actual users of these technologies. So some of the work that I found very inspiring is the Republicans project. So also kind of situating my work as well. My work is like very focused specifically on US-based queer communities. So within the US context, the Republicans project has used generative image models to create images of anti-LGBTQ plus politicians dressed in drag, and then use that platform to raise money for queer causes, as well as to kind of critique current political moments. This kind of shows the radical potential of these technologies potentially when we think beyond simply issues of representation. So my work is guided primarily by queer feminist theory, in particular the work of Sarah Ahmed. So long before the AI research community was thinking about issues of alignment, Sarah Ahmed was talking about this in the context of queer phenomenology, looking at the normative orientations, including Orientalism, of objects. She, in her work, describes straightening devices as the ways in which objects and bodies are oriented and aligned in very normative directions, be that cis-heteronormativity, whiteness, westernness, etc. Then her subsequent work on what's the use, she explores the ways in which kind of not only objects shape our interactions, but the actual agency of people to resist or misuse objects. She describes queer use as ways that things can be used in unintended ways or by those who are unintended, by designers. So in this work, I was interested in a couple of research questions. Kind of one was a really simple question around how queer artists might wish to engage with generative AI, how their experiences intersect with quote-unquote state-of-the-art models, state-of-the-art at the time. So this study was conducted in early 2024. So it's looking at GPT-4 and DALL-E 3. And then kind of what kind of imagined queer futures people might have. So in order to understand this, I conducted a workshop study over the course of 5 weeks with 13 queer artists. This involved a couple of components, so it's a mixed method approach. We developed a technology probe, which was a website that allowed participants to have access to GPT-4 and DALL-E 3, as well as collecting log data about how they were engaging with these technologies. We conducted 5 weeks of virtual workshops. We actually held 2 each week. We had people in multiple time zones. So the goal of this was to allow for people to try to find ways to participate and show up without having to be too rigid and in any one person's schedule. So each workshop had slightly different compositions. And to facilitate conversations in these workshops, we started each workshop with these design probes. So we would create a Google slide deck ahead of time, and as pre-work would encourage people to respond to these kind of weekly provocations. And then the conversations in the workshop would always begin with kind of sharebacks from participants about their work. And So digging into our findings, we kind of make the argument that GPT-4 and DALL-E 3 function as these very straight models, straight here being highly normative, drawing again on the work of Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology. So one way in which this kind of straightening or keeping things in line took place was this kind of notion of enforcing conservative safety. So P15 is an activist, an anarchist, and a poet who had a really difficult time either generating images or writing about things that were critical of the police. She went on to say, I kind of hate the way that DALL-E 3 uses identity as almost a form of propaganda, like copaganda. I feel like DALL-E 3 uses these images of women and women of color to legitimize policing. So of the images of police that she was able to generate, the vast majority of them were women of color, which doesn't represent the actual white supremacist violence of police in the United States. Similar concerns were raised around representations of bodies. So this includes the foreclosure of sexuality, but also any types of representations of bodies were often blocked by DALL-E 3's content moderation system. P4 went on to explain that they feel it's because these models are politically averse. This tool is used to be productive, and talking about the body isn't productive. This kind of notion of not safe for work was a common through line throughout the workshop, with people constantly reflecting on what makes me not safe for whose work. Another kind of concern was raised around these kind of social biases, the one that we're all pretty familiar with. People raised concerns about straightening and the literal representations of images, as well as kind of imagining that content moderation systems might be contributing to this. So this is a collage that P13, who is a homoerotic visual artist, created. After a hard time generating images of queer people and queer intimacy, they prompted DALL-E 3 to generate 24 images of intimacy. He noted that none of these seemed to include intimacy between two men, hence why the kind of negative space of the 5 times where the prompt violated DALL-E 3's content moderation policy, that's where you can see kind of queer intimacy peeking in. Another concern was raised around stylistic biases. This is particularly important as art is a really crucial aspect of culture, as is language. So, for example, P14, who is an art educator, a performance artist, and a glitch artist, explained, "I can't for the life of me get DALL-E 3 to do anything bad. Everything it makes is pristine and pretty and really formed. I'm not interested in that. I want something that's haunting." Kind of here we see a undermining of queer aesthetic sensibilities in this preference for glitches that have been literally ironed out and straightened out in contemporary text-image models. Similarly, P8, who's an indigenous poet from the American Southwest, explained, talking about a type of pottery style from his culture, AI cannot show you a kazada-like pottery because it fills an empty space and hyper-patternizes. Here we see similar preferences for symmetry and repetition, unable to represent the asymmetrical and fluid style of art from his culture, further indicating the ways that stylistic biases actually are a really important and underlooked aspect of social biases. So people still actually had agency to choose how they wanted to participate with these models. People actually developed a variety of kind of sophisticated techniques to overcome model normativities. So in response to the kind of concerns around the kind of very normative style, P14 used GPT-4 to try to help them revise prompts to make the art less cliche. But even then, that was still insufficient to break out of these stylistic biases embedded in these models. Another strategy was circumventing moderation systems, what is sometimes maligned as jailbreaking by some in the fact community. So P15, in response to the inability to generate work that was kind of critical of the police, finally was able to generate images critical of the police by using a signifier, in this case, a pig representing the epithet of calling cops pigs, as a way of representing a critique that was kind of more obfuscated than a more direct critique of police brutality. In fact, the unigram that was most associated with being rejected by DALL-E 3's content moderation system was ACAD, which stands for All Cops Are Bastards. And at the same time, participants still found ways to make use of these normative models in their art making. So P11 is an installation in textile arts, meaning they work in 3 dimensions, and they have to sometimes create sketches, communicate with clients. The kind of realistic style of DALL-E 3 was actually helpful in that case. Similarly, tons of participants used GPT-4 to help with certain writing tasks that are peripheral to their art making, be that debugging code or writing cover letters for grants or jobs. When we think about AI and art, we're often so focused on generative AI as the producer of art, but there's all sorts of kind of subtle work around art making that goes into being an artist, the type of things that CSCW scholars might call articulation work. So kind of a little short on time, but main takeaways I want us to think about is, 1, the ways that policies intended to promote quote-unquote safety and responsibility can end up silencing marginalized communities. The need to really interrogate aesthetic pluralism, so calling into question what it means for art or kind of a creative tool to be quote-unquote state-of-the-art or aesthetically better than another. And I also want us to kind of rethink what it might mean to quote-unquote unstraighten generative AI. The concerns around the overly diverse images of police is very kind of representative of how simplistic solutions like simply improving diversity of training data or query rewriting are unlikely to address people's needs. Yeah, thank you so much. Wait, I'm going backwards. Yeah, I'm also on the job market. If anyone has postdocs, let me know.